Okay, hi everyone. This is part one of week 10's lectures, and it will actually be the final recorded lecture from me this semester. The next week's lecture is already up. It's a series of DIY slides for you to follow your way through. So, this is the last time we get to do this. And hopefully what I managed to do in this session is to pull together a number of the ideas that we've been talking about the whole way through this semester. So my aim today is to talk about where we've got to at this point in this very crazy 3 months that we've all been experiencing. So what I want to do is to give you a general sense of the contemporary, what it means to be thinking about the contemporary now, as kind of a final point before you go on and write about what the contemporary will be into the future. And so in doing this, I want you to think about all the places we've been and all the kinds of works that we've talked about and thought about. So works like this, The Lie of the Land, which is a collection of bomb casings found lying around in Vietnam that have been turned into boats that hang in a gallery and operate as plant feeders, as surfaces for plants to grow in. So something that has shifted its cultural place, its political place, its economic place, it's engaging with the environmental and also the technological. So a work like this for me is kind of a model of where we've got to with contemporary art at the moment. Something that places together all of these elements and helps us think about these elements and what they mean to us now as we head into yet another unseen future. So what I want you to be thinking about as I sort of work through this final set of slides and these final set of ideas is in what ways these contexts for contemporary art, these 5 contexts for contemporary art, are indicators of the present, but also in what way are they indicators of the future. And what I want to do is talk about this and put it together with a short case study from artworks from the Pacific region, because that's where I'm thinking at the moment. It's where my thinking's going. It's the kind of work that I'm doing, so it's influencing what we're doing here. And I know we've been thinking about a lot of other things over the past 3 months, but something that hasn't gone away and hasn't stopped my thinking has been the relationship between humans and the environment, the relationship that we tend to name as the Anthropocene. And you'll have realised that this is kind of a key concern for contemporary art. It's a key concern that has sat underneath a lot of the artworks that we've talked about over the past 10 weeks. It's a key concern that's not going away. And whenever I've talked about this, I've always talked about it with a set of slides that look like this. They're a set of slides that were put together actually for the first time in 2005. This is a set of slides from 2010, so they're 10 years old, but there's something that you will recognise about them. You will recognise that they're all increasing, and this was what was put together as a way of visualising and getting us to think about this concept of the Great Acceleration. So the Great Acceleration has been used to think about and talk about this human-environment relationship. But I know that you can't help but look at these images. This is another set of them that we used at the same time as part of the IGP program that show Earth system trends. And we can't help but look at these and think about other graphs that are much more familiar to us right now, and the direction that those graphs are growing and the hope that we have for those graphs to flatten out soon. So we've got these Earth system trends we've got social and economic trends. These two things are not going away. These two things are still part of what we label and name as the Anthropocene. And what I've been talking about throughout this subject is the way that contemporary art engages with and helps us to think about the present, and the present is the Anthropocene. So we've thought about things like this. I've talked about Mitchell Whitelaw's bracelet, and we've thought about, art and the Holocene, art and the Anthropocene, art and climate change, the environment, the capitalocene, this idea that art is always engaged with capital and economics, or the plantationocene, that art is engaged with histories of slavery, histories of control, and also histories of crop growing and food. All of these things are part of contemporary art today. We can't talk or think about contemporary art without thinking about these wider pictures of social and cultural change and transformation. And there are artworks that talk about this specifically. Works of design like this, which is one of my favorites, the Carbon Map, and you can see the website there, carbonmap.org, where you can change the size and shape of the planet according to certain sets of criteria. So this has shifted the size of the planet according to emissions. The countries are sized according to their CO2 emissions. In this map, the planet has been resized and the countries are shown relative to the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. So this is an artwork. It's a work of design, but it's also a work of art because it helps us to aestheticize, it helps us to imagine, and it helps us to think through the contemporary environment and the contemporary context that we're all dealing with. More familiar to you might be this work by Olafur Eliasson that helps map the contemporary through these 5 frameworks that I've been talking about. So through the cultural frameworks where we're thinking about global inequity, where we're thinking about connections between people and place. Through political frameworks where we think about governmental organisations. This is sitting outside the COP meetings where the heads of governments are meeting and talking and thinking about what response they will have to climate change. This work also speaks to economic environments. It talks about ocean economies and land economies, but also financial framing. What is the financial kind of cost of this huge ice watch? It speaks to technological changes and transformations. I mean, we talk about this as an environmental work. We talk about it in its context of being relative to global earth systems and to large-scale environmental degradation. But I want you to think about it in the way that it connects to these other elements as well. So previously in this subject, we've talked about keywords a lot and we've talked about thematic framing a lot. And what I'm talking about today is this larger kind of meta framing, which is the social and cultural contexts in which art occurs. And I'm giving these 5 contexts to you: the cultural, the political, the economic, the technological, and the environmental. So we might look at a work like this by Chow Fei called Whose Utopia, in which workers in factories dance their fantasies, dance their imagined worlds after hours. And in it, Chow Fei helps us to think about cultural relationships, so socio-economic relationships between people, connections between place and people. But she does it through imagination. This is a film which you watch in an art gallery. It's an imagined space, but also a real space for these workers. Or Ai Weiwei's Law of the Journey that some of you might have seen a few years ago at the Sydney Biennale, that sort of takes us into the political space, where Ai Weiwei helps us to think about governmental and non-governmental organisations, but in particular forces us to consider these issues of war and migration. These massively overscaled figures that sort of filled this entire space challenge us to think about our own bodies and our own relationships to these kinds of environments. Or Kui Zhui's map of technological ethics which was is this enormous map that was at the APT9, in which economic framings of the earth sort of take over everything. So you can see there are islands of new energy. There are lobby groups, there is waste groups, there's whaling happening out at sea. But there's also the Garden of Eden of Greenpeace and endangered species sort of living over the river from the farm animals. So what Shwe does is he kind of maps all of these things that we think of as kind of economic concepts that maybe we think don't have a lot to do with us and to do with the art world, maps them back onto a map of the earth. This is all drawn with charcoal directly onto the wall of the gallery, and the gallery wall must be 20 meters high. It's enormous. And in this work, it sort of locates us inside this economic environment. We can't step away from it. We can't sort of center ourselves separate to all of its different framings of the planet and framings of ways of thinking. And then along with that becomes this kind of technological framing. And usually the technological is held up as this, this way of helping us out of something, this innovation. But whenever I think of the technological, I think of these works by Andrea Zittel, which are built into the desert in the United States. And you can go and stay. You can live in these housing pods for a period of time. You can take up residency in them. They're a little camp that is designed to get us thinking carefully about sustainability and innovation and the different ways that people might operate in space and across the world. So these are like critical artworks that help us not only shift our understandings of ourselves and of the world and our place in it, but our behaviors, our relationships with other people. This is a technological framing of the artwork, but technology has another flavor to it as well. And hopefully you've all already watched this video by Hito Stell that really pushes us to challenge our own framings of the planet and of the world, but also how we are seen across the planet at the moment. So what she uses is she uses drone technology, she uses satellite sensing technology, and makes us aware of what it means to be out in the world right now, so that we're thinking about surveillance in capital, but also in particular we're thinking about structures of control and what it means that all of our behaviors and thoughts and everything is controlled by certain kind of technological means. Now, I don't say that in a kind of a fatalistic or sort of paranoid kind of sense. If you watch her video, you'll understand that this is as critical as it is also humorous and playful, and just really pushing us to think about and challenge these kind of technological framings of the earth and the planet that we engage with. Which brings me back finally again to Olafur and the environmental framing, which really is the one that sort of is starting to overtake some of the other framings. So that as soon as we start thinking about political or economic or technological framings, we find that they all intersect with or entangled with the environmental. So that when we're thinking about global earth systems, we're thinking about how artists are engaging with global earth systems, or how they're engaging with climate change and getting us to think these things through in very different ways. So we've got these 5 frames, which are sort of meta frames that sit on top of the themes and keywords that we've talked about throughout this subject. And what I want you to do is to think about the ways that these frames start to contribute a politics to contemporary art. So when we started this subject, we talked a lot and thought a lot about what is contemporary art. When does it happen? What kinds of work is it? What kind of concerns does it have? Now I want you to start thinking more about what does contemporary art do? How does it shift the way that we think and the way that we understand. This work by Angela Tiatia called Holding On is a video work in which she lies on a concrete pier as the tides come up. And as the tide comes up and the waves wash over her, she finds it more and more difficult to hold on, to stay on this tiny little fragment of the planet that is her little fragment right at this minute. And she engages with all of these frameworks that we've been thinking about. The cultural and political environment of the Pacific Islands right now means that climate change and economic stability are closely and deeply entwined. Along with that is this sort of sense that maybe there's a technological solution to this, but maybe there's also another kind of technology, another way of being that might help people think this situation through. Or this collaborative work by Robin White and Ruha Fiafit, which is a massive tapa panel, meters and meters wide and high, in which we see the early economic exchange across the Pacific. We see umu and bell tea going one way, and we see fish and flying fish and species going the other way. And then we see the long-finned eel. So we see the boats, we see the exchange of bodies, we see the exchange of goods occurring across the surfaces of this work. Equally technological, equally economic, equally cultural, social. All of these 5 elements start to come together as we start thinking about the ways that contemporary artists are pushing with these larger frameworks, these larger ways of being, but also these larger understandings of what it means to be in the world today. Now, some of this work is also future focused, utopian imagination of what the world might be and how it might become. Neil Eremia worked with Black Grace Dance Company and a group of students to work with them to imagine a future Pacific, a future world in which people would be or behave in a certain way. And this dance performance kind of pulled together these 5 frames that I've been talking about, helping us to think about what it means to exist and live inside this time of the great acceleration, this time of increasing measures of socioeconomic consumption, and the way that this is overlaid with Earth systems. What kind of future do we imagine that includes these 2? Likewise, what kind of future might we imagine in which global cultural and political and economic and technological things are interconnected? What way do we imagine the human impact on the planet? Whereas at the moment we're thinking a lot about the impact of very small things on the human body, we can't forget about the human impact on the planet itself. And then how does this connect into a way of thinking from here? Australia is in the Pacific. It is part of the Pacific social and technical and political and environmental context. So how do we think these kinds of blue economies from here? And how do they help frame the politics of art as we think forward? So a lot of this subject has been looking at and thinking about international practices, introducing you to the centres of the art world in New York, in London. I know we've spent a lot of time at the Tate Modern thinking about art that's there. But as you work towards your final assessment for this subject, I want you to think carefully about what it means to be here, what it means to be in the Pacific, what it means to be in Australia, what it means to be operating in these environments that in which all of these aspects cross together. So when you're thinking about how do I write an essay that is about the future, I want you to put on these utopian frames. Think about what kind of future artists are helping you imagine. And turn to works that help you think this through clearly and simply. For me, a key frame of how I'm thinking these ideas is the work of Heto Stale. So again, if you haven't watched the video, watch the video. It's bizarre, it's crazy. It'll take a while for you to understand it and think through what it is that she's doing. But also read this essay by her and think about the way that she's talking about what art does. As she says here, simply look at what it does, not what it shows. Think about these relationships between art and this new kind of world that we might be transitioning to. Contemporary art is a brand name without a brand, ready to be slapped onto almost anything. Well, what does this mean? Do we want contemporary art to operate in this way? Do we want contemporary art to be this, or do we want it to be something else, something really different? And at the end of her article, she talks about this kind of difference, about the way that art affects reality. Art is entangled in everything we do and how we think and how we understand the world. So she talks about art as messy, embedded, troubled, irresistible. So it's both a negative and a positive. In her writing, she often entangles these two things together, the negative and the positive. She says we could try to understand its space as a political one instead of trying to represent a politics that is happening elsewhere. Art is itself political. It's not outside of politics. Politics resides within the production and distribution and reception of contemporary art. And as she says, if we embrace this, we might be ready to kind of move forward and move on to whatever this future is that's coming. So I hope that you can take some of these ideas on and take them forward into your final assessment. And as I just said, what I want you to really think about is not what is contemporary art, but what can contemporary art do? So I'll leave you with that. Hopefully that gives you some things to think about as you go forward into the next assignment. And thanks for traveling with me on this crazy journey over this semester. You've got a few more weeks of work to do. You've got you do DIY lectures, you've got writing workshops happening in the tutorials, and you've got your essay to work on. I'll be available on Moodle forums for any kind of conversation that you want to have, any kind of ideas that you want to feed out to me. Okay, thank you all.